So we are now recording. I would like to invite Kristen, if you would like to kind of begin with sharing a little bit about yourself, your role at PHS, and then if you would like to just popcorn over to wherever you would like to go next, and we'll get started together.
Absolutely. I'm Kristen Gatos. I work in the Communications and Development Department at PHS. And I just want to thank Alex and all of you for kind of inviting us here. I am fortunate enough to have grown up in media next door to Swarthmore, so I'm already aware of the kind of great community that Swarthmore is, and having spoken to Alex on and off for the past year, I've heard so much about Swarthmore Presbyterian Church and all of the great things you guys have going on. So I'm excited to kind of be here today. So I'm going to pass it off to Sonia.
Hi, so my name is Sonia Prescott, and I am in, let's see, I basically define myself, I'm in two different departments. So I'm in the Public Services Department, where I work with researchers, usually genealogists, and help them find records. And then I also work in the Communications Department, where I work with blog posts, our social media feeds, all these different avenues that we share our message to the larger Presbyterian world. And today I'm going to share a little story with you from Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. I'm going to see if I can share my screen.
Would you mind then introducing Fred before you jump in? And then,
oh, sure.
And then I'll actually ask those who are here from SPC if you would just like to say your name. Maybe if you serve as an elder or deacon, and then we'll just go from there.
Well, hi, my name is Fred Tangerman, and I'm the Director of Communications at PHS. I feel like I'm maybe not doing enough because Kristen and Sonia work across these two different teams, and I'm sort of exclusively in communications. But in communications, I have a lot of fun working in all sorts of different spaces and collaborating with my colleagues across the PHS team. And it also gives me a great opportunity to meet with Presbyterians like yourselves and everybody else that might be interested in the work of the Historical Society. So it's a real joy to be here with you today. Thank you to Alex and everybody else for having us into this space.
Thank you, Fred. Dory, do you want to just say hello, and we'll go, you can call on the next SPC member here. Oh, you're muted.
My name is Dory McGrath, and I'm the parish administrator at Swarthmore Presbyterian Church. I grew up in the church. I moved away in my early years of marriage, but have been back. So I had maybe a 15-year gap, but otherwise I'm a very, very long-term member of the church. Who else is next? Sue LeGros.
Oh, I'm Sue LeGros. I think I've been a member of the church since 1981. I did move away for a few years with the job, but I'm back, and I'm a member of the Adult Formation Committee, along with some others on this call.
Charlotte, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Charlotte Hall, and I have been a member of SPC probably about 8 years, joined when we moved here, retired from Florida to Philadelphia area, which is odd, but family brought us here. I am an elder serving on session right now and chair of our outreach committee.
Thank you, Charlotte. Kathy, would you like to go next?
Hi, I'm Kathy Watts. I'm currently a deacon at SPC. I've been with SPC for about 10 years now. And I'm also, Marge Holcomb is my mother, and she's having technical difficulties with her speaker, so I'm going to introduce her also. She is part of the Peacekeeping Committee and active in adult formation also.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Marge. I hope you can also watch this after in case the technical difficulties continue. Carlin, if you're here.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm muted and video muted because I'm also eating lunch right now. So So it's not really pleasant to look at, and I don't necessarily want that on the recording. But my name's Carlin Miller. I'm on the Adult Formation Committee at SPC. I've been a member of SPC almost my entire life. There was a little gap at the beginning, but you know, I'm a long-term member since way back.
Thank you, Carlin. All right, I'll give it back to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We thought we would kick off with a little video tour of PHS. It's unfortunate that you can't come visit us in person right now, so we recorded a video of a kind of walkthrough of the archives that we hope kind of conveys the scope of the collections that we have. And then after that, we'll just talk a little bit about what's in the building. So I'm gonna screen share and roll this video. It's about a 5-minute video, and then we could talk a little bit about it afterwards. Can everybody see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So a really quick kind of walkthrough of PHS. And as you saw kind of at the beginning of the video, that PHS was organized in 1852. It was a call in the General Assembly of the church at the time. They called for a kind of location to save the records of the Presbyterian Church kind of as they were being generated. So PHS was organized in 1852. We've always been in Philadelphia, though not at our current location. Where we are located right now is at 5th and Lombard Street. If you're familiar with Old Pine Presbyterian Church, we share a property with them. Before that, we were a few other locations, but most recently, we were located at the Witherspoon Street building, which is at the kind of intersection of Walnut Street and Juniper Streets in Philadelphia. And then in 1967, we moved to our current location. Some of the records, the types of records that we have at PHS, we have kind of the bound volumes of, we have like a library collection, which we kind of walked through first. And those are all published materials that you can visit PHS and request and research them, read them in the archives. We also have kind of unique records created by the Presbyterian Church. So that could be things like, you know, correspondence from people who work at the agencies of the Presbyterian Church. That could be minutes that have come out of meetings. We have a lot of records of missionaries who visited, you know, countries all over the world on behalf of the Presbyterian Church. We have, you know, records of ministers. We have a large collection of personal papers from kind of important historical figures that can all be found at PHS. But the kind of most important thing that we save is what our mission is to save the records of congregations. So we save records from PCUSA congregations at no cost to the church. So if a church is afraid of, you know, if they have their minutes, their session minutes or registers in like a dusty closet, they can send them to PHS and we'll save them in our facility at no cost to the church. And that's just a way of making sure that churches will save their history forever and can visit them at any time. Churches still maintain ownership of these records, even if they're at PHS, so they can be requested back at any time. I know we had kind of saved a little time at the end to talk about how Swarthmore Presbyterian Church might be able to research at PHS, but I thought it might be a good time to ask Sonia about some of the records that we have at PHS from SPC, because I know you did a little searching around beforehand, right, Sonia?
Yes, I did. And I did locate a few records that we have. I'm going to pull those up so that you can see them. Not the actual records themselves, but the catalog descriptions of the records that we have. So we have,
As you look that up, just one thing that stood out to me when I actually got a visit, and once pandemic's over, we would love to have a little visitation, is that archive at the bottom floor, I think goes for a block, a city block. So I remember being surprised on how long that room is. And then even the rare book collection, I remember at some point finding like Calvin's Institutes from like 1582 or something of the sort. I was just shocked that I was able to hold it.
So yeah, this is an example of one of the catalog records that we have related to Swarthmore Presbyterian Church. And this has histories, church bulletins, clippings, reports, and directories. And it says here that it has records dating from 1916 to 1995, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those are all, that it's comprehensive. It may be one item within this group of records that is from 1916, and then the next closest thing is from 1932. So that's why once you get into, you would actually have to get into the records to see exactly what we have here, but this is kind of a general description of those records. Another catalog entry that we have for Swarthmore Presbyterian Church is here. And these records include a lot of minutes, session minutes, reports. There's a membership list from 1966, but this catalog record gives a little more information about the type of records that I think would be interesting to congregation members. And both of these catalog descriptions come from Calvin, which is our main search online database that you can search yourself. You would just go to Calvin on our website, and then I did this search just by going to author, church, or institution and typed in Swarthmore, and these are the items that came up.
And I'm just going to link Calvin in the chat in case people want to look around. We have a few different ways that you can kind of search through our collections, and I'd be happy to pass those links along after people are just curious and want to look around. We have a question from Susan. She was wondering, why are certain records from the last 50 years restricted? Sonia, do you have a good answer for that?
I can give a general answer. One of the reasons that we do that is if those records may contain personal information about congregation members, then they are restricted. So if there's any information that that may relate to a specific individual that is more current, then we may restrict access to those records.
Yeah.
Oh,
Charlotte, I think you're muted.
Go ahead, Charlotte.
What does it mean to be restricted? Can no one look at them?
well, it depends. We would have to look at the record itself. Sometimes one of the ways that we get around that is that, like, let's say if there was a record that was related to a specific person that you were interested in, what we could do then is we could actually go into the records and find the information that's related to that specific person and photocopy that or digitize that for you without giving you access to the entire register or the entire restricted file.
Would the restrictions include session minutes? If you have session minutes, and I don't know whether you have session minutes, then for how far back?
We do have, I was just going to say, we do have session minutes for this congregation, but I'm not sure how if they're restricted or not. Fred, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, just to connect with what you were saying, Sonia, just to make everybody sure that we're on the same page. All records at PHS that come from congregations have a kind of blanket 50-year restriction on them. So that's basically our standing practice, so that when we look at some of those dates and we come up to 1970, that's when, if it's a record before 1970, it's generally open to the public. Now, I think if you, at your congregation, for instance, were interested in looking at records that we've collected on deposit in the last 50 years, what you would do is we would just, somebody on this call very well might be, maybe it's Dory, might be able to just send us a communication that says we want to have those records accessible to this researcher from our congregation. And so it's very easy for us to find a way for you to access those records from your own congregation. So those restrictions are really in place for people outside of your church community, so that when they want to look at things, there's just that distance put in place, so that they're reflecting on engaging with records that are from kind of 50 years or older.
I'm sorry.
Just to be helpful probably to our people, is that we are fortunate to have enough vault space in our building that we do have all of the session records going back to the founding of the church in the building. I think that right now the ones that are on file with PHS are from times when there has been some sort of intervention or occasion where Presbytery got directly involved in the church, and we asked to have those kept on record by PHS. We are approaching a time when we really do need to think about turning documents over to PHS, because we're running out of physical space, and we've started to look at, do we want to invest in another vault or not? So I would love to be part of that conversation sooner rather than later. But right now, for anybody researching things at the church, I can provide access to the things they need.
Yeah, just so I understand, are the records at PHS digitized or only the catalog digitized?
That's a good question, and I think it's one that kind of connects also with Carlin's question. She was wondering how, records get submitted to PHS, if they're solicited or do congregations approach us. And we actually have a records manager at PHS he's kind of in charge of reaching out to congregations or helping congregations, decide on what should come to PHS, or what can be kept, and what's really like the important material that should be saved in perpetuity in our collections. And we're happy to pass the name of that person along. His name is David Stanunas. Looks like Sonia's got his information there, but he's a great person to talk to about just these kind of questions. And one other service that we offer is digitization for church records. So a lot of the records that you see in Pearl are digital repository, which we can find a link to, but the kind of records that you see online that are digitized in our collection aren't necessarily church records. They're usually photographs or correspondence that come out of personal papers or collections that maybe like speak to a broader kind of global story that we're trying to help to tell. But churches can send their records to PHS and have them digitized for a fee. And we can link that information or send it to you guys as well. But I can share as an example of what kind of digitized church records look like. We have a staff of about two or three people, say 2.5 people, who their sole job is to digitize records and make them available for people and for congregations. And we can handle kind of records of any size or shape. And one example of what they might look like after the fact is, I can find it. So here is an example of a set of digitized session minutes from the Presbyterian of Philadelphia. It's their first set of session minutes. So this is one that we do have in Pearl because it's kind of identified as a kind of important story we want to tell on a larger scale. But if Swarthmore or another congregation would want to get their church records digitized, they would look like this, and you would get a file of different sets of minutes that you identified as minutes you needed digitized.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kristen. That's a great reminder. And you saw during the tour where that digitization studio is. You saw Allison, who's one of the members of that group, scanning a newspaper in that case. But that's where that work happens. And when it comes time for us to talk with you about some options about digitizing certain records that you want to have available for the entire membership of your congregation, that's something that we can do. Is we can bring in some records that you want to continue to hold at your facility in Swarthmore, but you might want some things digitized so that you can have a backup copy that's digital of those, but also have something that you can share out with your membership. And that is, as Kristen and Sonia have give you information already about that, that's something we'd be very happy to talk to you about later on.
Fred, this might be a good question for you, but Kathy was wondering what kind of books are in the rare book collection?
So a lot of the books that are in the rare books collection are items that were kind of legacy items at the earlier PHS. So Kristen started off telling you how we began in 1852, and some of the early leadership of PHS would sort of bring in personal book collections of this or that prominent Presbyterian. And so a lot of those items come from those individual libraries of those leaders in church history going back to the 19th century. Alex was mentioning how on a visit he paid to PHS that he got to look at and handle a Calvin's Institutes from the 16th century. That is an item of that type that comes out of an individual's personal library that over time was added to the PHS collections. And so to be a little bit more descriptive about what types of things are in there, they're items that speak to a lot of history that dates back to the colonial period in this country, but also to the Reformation period. And so when we were doing storytelling most recently about Ulrich Zwingli and his ministry in Zurich, we have items in the rare books collection that speak to that. We have a lot of commentaries on the books of confession, on Bibles. And in fact, one of our upcoming PHS live sessions, which maybe we'll plug a little bit later, is going to be looking at some of those rare books that we think are the most interesting, and we're going to be just telling individuals about those. So that's a little bit more about what's in that rare books collection.
Are there criteria for what can or should be submitted? And do you ever decline to accept certain materials?
Yeah, that's a great question. We receive people's communications, a lot of emails or phone calls where people say, I have this item, I have that item. Is this right for the PHS collections? And what we do is we connect them with somebody on staff who can sort of give them information about if it makes sense to send that item to PHS, or if there's another repository that might make more sense. A lot of times people want to have items that are not so far from where they live. And so in those cases, we might give them information about libraries that are nearby that are also collecting. But if it really speaks centrally to Presbyterian history and we don't have that item, if it's a unique item that's not to be found elsewhere, those are the kind of things that we really prioritize about bringing in. And I saw in the chat a great question that's connected to this about, how do we decide how do we ask people for collection materials? And that's another thing that we're, I think, going to get a chance to talk about when Sonia and I give you a little bit, some examples about the kind of stories that we're looking at that are responding to the collection materials that we're bringing in now, which what we're collecting now is very much in keeping with what we've always collected about the history of the church, but we're collecting around a lot of contemporary history that, was not all that well represented from a topic perspective earlier in the collection. So I wonder if now might be a good time to go ahead and ask Sonia to tell us a little bit more about that. Unless Kristen, you or Alex have anything else that would be good for us to go over before that.
I think that's good. Thank you. Thank you, Fred.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about a story of the West Witherspoon Presbyterian Church and William Drew Robeson. Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church is located in Princeton, New Jersey. It was formed by the African-American members of the First Presbyterian Church in Princeton in 1840. One of its earliest pastors was William Drew Robeson, the father of Paul Robeson, who was called to lead the church in 1876. We are fortunate to have in our collection a copy of the session minutes from that day that he was installed on June 25th, 1876. And that's what the photo there is of. It's those session minutes when he was first installed. Robeson spent 20 years in the congregation's pulpit, known for his steadfast advocacy of civil and human rights for African Americans. This activism would lead to his ouster in 1901. An investigative commission of the Presbytery of New Brunswick pursued Robeson for 9 months, making its final recommendations in October 1900. The commission states in its report that white members of Princeton's churches were agitated by Robeson, noting a general unrest and dissatisfaction on the part of others, meaning residents of Princeton, who have been the church's friends and helpers. Ultimately, Robeson resigned February 1st, 1901, but the presbytery continued his salary until May. He and his family also would go to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and he served the St. Luke AME in Westfield, New Jersey. In his farewell sermon of January 27th, 1901, Robeson urged his congregation not to give in to bitterness or despair. As I review the past and think upon many scenes, my heart is full of love. Do not be discouraged, and do not think your past work is in vain. Now this was, as I said, this happened between 1876 and 1901. In 2015, a 3-member panel of the Senate of the Northeast visited to read the session minutes related to this incident. Those original session minutes from 1876 and their session minutes from 1901. This 3-member panel came to review those session minutes. And later that year, the Presbytery formally apologized to Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church for executing what has been called an ecclesiastical lynching. And the Senate of the Northeast retired the $175,000 mortgage on the manse the Robesons lived in. Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church has since developed the Robeson Manse as a center for the study of human rights and a testament to the Robeson family. It is now called the Paul Robeson House of Princeton, a center for social justice. So I know I went through that story pretty quickly, but essentially, you know, what we see here is an example where folks were able to come in. There was an injustice that happened, and then folks were able to come in and see the original session minutes related to what happened, and then find some kind of way to right that wrong and to fix, you know, what had been done in the past. If any of you would like to learn more, I can share these links that I have in the presentation into the chat, and it tells you more of the full story about what happened there. But I just think this is a fascinating story that you can get from our collections. Read word for word exactly what was happening in 1876 and 1901, and then finally in 2015. So I'm going to go ahead and share these in the chat menu so that all of you can learn more about this interesting moment in our history. Did anyone have any questions? Yes, Fred.
Yeah, I kind of have a question for our friends at Swarthmore. You know, just looking around your website, I see that you all are engaged in, you know, a lot of work that is looking at racial justice issues and things that are, you know, very much in the public conversation now, which is so important. And that story that Sonia just told is an evidence of Presbyterians using their history to engage with a past issue, but also to atone for it, to come up with a way to address it. And I would love to hear a little bit about some of the things that are happening at your church, and, you know, some of the things that that you're engaged with, or just questions that you have about that work. We have been putting together some resources that we think are very helpful to congregations when they're looking to just sort of take a deeper dive into the denomination's history with regards to racial justice and some other areas. So I'd just love to hear from you all about what discussions you're having at church. And Alex, I know you could speak to this, and I'm sure that your members could as well.
So unless one of our members are inclined, thank you, Fred, for that question, and thank you, Sonia, for that brief presentation. I think it's part of what we're interested in hearing how this is something we shared with our congregation when the denomination had their week of action this summer. Where part of that conversation was reflecting on leaders in the church that fought for social justice at times, not because the PCUSA was supportive, but in spite of. And it was part of I think, a good conversation we were having, especially in the adult formation team, of how do we tap into those stories of the past, into truth-telling stories today. I think this also steps into some of the work that we have been doing on our website. As you saw, we've had our our resolve against racism, where we encouraged our congregants to offer statements of both I believe and I resolve, which was a gathering of a lot of our members sharing their responses. And then at the moment, we're also having conversations within our session in our church of what it would look like to really create a possibly a standing committee, a steering committee, to talk about how we can continue embodying an anti-racist approach towards our ministry, while at the same time also giving ourselves space to have those truthful conversations of where we've been and where we want to go. Hopefully that kind of captures some of what we're doing. That was very brief, but if any of the members would like to chime in, you're more than welcome to. Charlotte?
I'd just like to add that this summer we had one of our, groups studying the history of institutional racism through a podcast that we listened to called Seeing White, and it really looked at it from the white perspective of the, how whites created race as a concept and then exploited it. And it was extremely enlightening. And I think that now adult formation is reading books and focusing on this. And one thing that I participated in the podcast study this summer. And one thing that struck me was the power of acknowledging the past and taking ownership of it. And I don't mean in the sense that maybe we did it, but that we own its legacy. And it's our responsibility to both make that known, what our history is, and to in some sense try to atone for it or reconcile ourselves to a different kind of life now. So I think it's a very, we're just sort of beginning to this work. I think it's very long term. I think we all believe that, that it's very long term, but that understanding the past is important to us.
And I'll also add, as a new person in this congregation, this church has done a lot of work in the past as well. I'm very active in having these conversations. So we're very thankful for the saints before us who have been involved in a lot of this work. And like Charlotte's sharing, both truth-telling about the things we need to own and also celebrating those things that we can build upon. Sue, were you going to share something before we kept going?
Oh, well, I was just going to add that the adult formation group just finished reading a book by an author named Eddie Glaude. It's called, he's a Princeton professor, and it's called Democracy in Black. And we did that over a series of several weeks. I think as a result of that, a lot of really good insights and discussion came out, which led many of us in the group to say, it's not enough to say what I can do or to just do small incremental individual things. It's important to find groups that you can work with as a group to try to have a bigger impact.
I'd just like to say the peacemaking committee has one of the emphasis has been gun control, but the other, we've had sponsored several programs on human trafficking for the community and for the church.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
That's so great to hear. I mean, those are such important conversations to be having. And it's, as Alex points out, you all have stood out for your congregation's engagement with these issues through the years. And if there's any way that the Historical Society can help with resources, things that come out of our collections that would bolster your study, one of the things that we might be able to share with you as a follow-on to this conversation is a self-study resources list that we put together that's on our website that shows you some of the denominational work that's happened or not happened through the years around the issue of racial justice. We could share that, and I know Kristen wanted to send the links that are being pasted into the chat so that you can with a little bit more leisure, follow up and click around to some of those things. So we just want to, again, offer up our services and our help in that important work. And so please do let us know how we can walk with you as you move forward on these issues. Sonia, that's such a riveting story for me about Paul Robeson's father, and it very much connects with the Robeson Center in West Philadelphia. And another story that we wanted to tell you about, which connects to the history of the Presbyterian Church, but really focuses in on the 20th century, from later in the 20th century, is another special collecting initiative that we have going. So Sonia was talking about the William Drew Robeson story in Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church, which very much connects to our effort to collect more materials about African American Presbyterians. And so that's an ongoing initiative and a focus of our work this year. A continuing focus as well, and that has been a focus in last year, was around LGBT rights in the Presbyterian Church. And so we had an initiative, and we still do, where we're bringing in materials that speak to that issue in the church. And one of the stories that we feel is very compelling, and we're creating a presentation that I wanted to share a little bit about that with you about, is around the story of a pastor named David Sint. David Sint went to the 1974 General Assembly in Louisville and held up a sign that said, "Is anyone else out there gay?" And in 1974, that was, that happened in the context of 1974, and it really created a lot of response in the church. And David Sint went on to have a ministry that focused on this issue of bringing equality and inclusion for LGBT Presbyterians. And so we've been bringing in materials that talk about that story, but as I mentioned, we've created this presentation, and this is being led by Liz Wittrigg, who is the Pam Byers Collecting Initiative leader, where we're bringing in recordings of David Sint and other materials that talk about that issue. And so one of the things, Alex, that we're looking to do is to find congregations around the country that are interested in sharing this presentation with their classes as a kind of a study guide, as an opportunity to engage with this aspect of Presbyterian history, but also to look at what it is to be a Presbyterian, and using David Sint's experience as a story to talk about that issue, but also to educate Presbyterians into how church polity works a little bit, and how an issue that starts in a certain year gets moved into task force and other committees and gets brought back to presbyteries and to votes by congregation, and how there's a process in place that's really important for Presbyterians, whether they're, teenagers or more mature Presbyterians that are looking at these issues, so that they can use these historical materials that are at PHS to reflect on this. And this is something that we're trying to do more of. We have wonderful collections that speak to congregations and their experiences around the country and to individual Presbyterians, but we've often been a sort of building that we need to bring people into the building to really have that work happen. And what we're doing now is trying to get this information out in ways that it's usable at the congregation level, and at the presbytery level, and even at the synod level. So I wanted to, if I could share my screen, to show you a few of those slides from this presentation. And hopefully you can all see this slide right now. So this is sort of the opening of the presentation. And again, David Sint holds up this sign over his head at the 1974 General Assembly. And we don't have any footage of what happens or recording, but you can imagine the kind of reception that would have met with in 1974. And so the presentation goes on to talk a little bit about David Sint's life. And then we use recordings that have happened with people who can speak to his ministry. But then we kind of dig a deeper dive into the issue of LGBT inclusion in the country. We build this presentation on materials that are to be found at PHS for the most part, that have come in through this collecting initiative. I wanted to go down to, I think it's slide 13, because this is where the part of the presentation that speaks about how change is happening in the Presbyterian Church really begins. It's broken down into the 3 P's of reform. Very important for a reformed people to understand these concepts, and that we've kind of broken it out into positions that somebody can take on an issue, the passion that individual or individuals bring to that issue, and then also, you know, an understanding of the polity, of the governance of the church, and how that really needs to be understood and kind of harnessed in a good way, or contended with if it's getting in the way of change happening in another way. So this, I won't show you more of the presentation because it goes on for 30 plus slides, but it is the kind of thing we'd be very interested in sort of perfecting in conversation with congregations like Swarthmore, giving you a chance to tell us what we need to do to make it more helpful, and then share it with a wider audience. This is an issue, LGBT inclusion, that very much connects with issues of racial justice. There is a lot of overlap in these issues, and as you would get to the later in this presentation, you can see how these communities of advocates in the church are really in lots of conversation with each other, and bringing materials to PHS that document that history, so that in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, these materials are available for people to study this issue. Very much in the way that people come to PHS to study abolition before the Civil War, using our materials. So that's a really exciting thing that we have going on. And again, we'll be excited to tell you more about these as they are developed and ready to be shared with you.
Thank you, Fred. And what began as a protest sign in 1974, if I remember correctly, it was then in 2015 that the Presbyterian Church USA approved to ordain clergy who are gay. That's correct, right?
Yeah, if it's not 2015, maybe 2013, 2014. You know how it goes back to the presbytery for a final vote, and then it comes back to the GA. It does that thing. But yeah, I think that's right, Alex.
Great, thank you for sharing that, Fred.
Yes, I think the Peacemaking Committee would be very interested in sponsoring something on that topic, and we'd like to ask Alex to get this for us. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, please share that with me. I know it'll be part of our conversation when we have adult formation. Our meeting is coming Sunday. It can be our next step in furthering that conversation, and then, of course, sharing those resources afterwards. That'd be great. Well, friends, I know that we're getting close to the end of our time, but so there's a lot of, I think, amazing things that the PHS is doing, carrying on the mission of being a place where records can be kept, where story sharing could be done. And I'm very thankful for what are, I think, small like capsules of like brief stories, but that there is so much power to them. I know that even one of my colleagues is a pastor at Witherspoon in Princeton, and he shared with me some of that history that he's stepping into. So I'm very thankful for y'all's time as we think about some of the history that even maybe SPC would like to research, etc. But I would like to give some space if there's any final questions from our members that you may like to ask, and then maybe any final remarks from PHS, maybe encouragement, etc. that you could give us. Yeah, I think there's also a lot of stuff to go into too. I think a lot of these links are going to be super helpful and possible things that we can read heading into Sunday.
And I also wanted to add, along with the David Sent story, we just recently shared on social media, which is a great place to see, our content about these stories. But we just recently shared on social media a copy, so I just shared it in the chat. You can listen to a sermon given by David Sent. if you click on that link there, it was part of our Sermon Sunday series that we were doing on Facebook, where we're sharing different sermons, and we're fortunate enough to have a sermon given by David Sent in the collection. So if you all wanted to check that out, that's another resource that's available.
That's awesome. Thank you. Well, friends, not seeing any more possible questions coming up, we'll turn it over to PHS for any final remarks.
I just want to thank you guys again for inviting us, and apologies for any dog noises you're about to hear. But yeah, for just inviting us and letting us share these stories. And, you know, I think Fred and Sonia both really kind of spoke to the stories that come out of PHS. You know, they come from session minutes, and they come from moments in congregations, and they speak to a much larger kind of global story. So we're here to help you guys find and tell those stories in any way we can. So we really appreciate it. And like Alex said, if you guys would like to start receiving our e-newsletter, please either shoot him an email with your information or just drop it here in the chat, and we'd be happy to copy that and add you to our list.
Great. Well, why don't we end with, I know we've kind of learned this. This is like an applause, a thank you. Can we shoot up an applause? Thank you for PHS for coming here. We are so thankful for your time, for sharing some of these stories. And I know that we continue to hold you all in prayer, continue to count on you all as a church partner, especially when it comes to telling the story of the faithful ministry of the church. So we are thankful for you all.
Thank you all so much for having us. And I want to just add to what Kristen was saying. You know, those stories you heard about are stories that connect directly with individual congregations. Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church in Princeton, and in Davidson, who went on and pastored at Lincoln Park Presbyterian Church in Chicago. We know you at Swarthmore have stories like those, and we want to help you kind of develop them and preserve them so that they're available for future members of your church to know about, but also the wider church and anybody with an interest in the religious history of this country. One of the things that we're kind of teeing up as well for congregations to think about is we're interested in being in conversation about if there's any ways we can help you with any oral histories, if you want to talk to each other at your church about the history of your church, interview members. We've been thinking about that a lot lately, and we would love to talk to you and see if there's ways that we can help you out with that. Those oral histories can be important ways to gather the history of your congregation that just hasn't been written down. So please think about that and all the other stuff we told you about, and we'll look forward to helping you out with any of that down the road.
Thank you, Fred.